If you want to get your dogs some tasty, delicious, fresh baked pumpkin treats that are great for their digestion, visit beautiesbiscuits.com. We've got turmeric varieties, peanut butter, all natural peanut butter. Parsley helps with stinky dog breath. I actually grow it right in my yard. So this season I am harvesting my parsley.
Yay.
And making fresh dog biscuits for you. And I also have CBD. Great for senior dogs, dogs that are anxious, hip pain, joint pain. Turmeric and CBD is wonderful. I got all the things. Use offer code LIES and save 20% at beautiesbiscuits.com.
Do it. Do it.
Because your dogs will love you for it, and so will I.
Autumn's Oddities is a strange and unusual podcast made by the strange and unusual, me, Autumn Gruby. Each week, I'll be taking you through some of the creepiest cases true crime has to offer. It won't only be true crime, I'll also be covering cryptids, haunted places, haunted things, and the true stories that inspired horror movies. Listen every Monday and Friday for new episodes. And remember, if it's creepy and weird, you'll find it here.
I'm Edward October, creator-host of October Pod, and we're both listening to Calls of Death on the Darkcast Network.
Welcome to Cause of Death 100 Seconds to Midnight. I'm your host, Jackie Moranti. As promised, I'm doing a Q&A episode about the podcast and about me. While I don't think it's particularly important that you know about your podcaster, I do think it's kind of interesting for you since I don't talk about myself much during the podcast. This is just a for fun episode, and hence the goofy music. It makes me really happy that I got so many questions from people for this episode. The one thing I didn't want to do was talk about my extensively impressive but really boring resume. I'll hit the highlights of that, but I'm not going to drone on about it. It's a snore. I promise you, it's a snore. Okay, so you know how to get a hold of me. The best way is to email me at jackie@causeofdeath100sex.net, or you can go to the website at www.causeofdeath100sex.net. At the website, you can find ways to support the show monetarily. I would ask that if you really want to support the show, please subscribe, rate, review, and share these episodes. Tell your friends about Cause of Death 100 Seconds to Midnight and suggest your favorite episode. Okay, so let's get to it. I've chosen not to shout out every person who has submitted questions. Most of you asked me not to mention your names anyway, so I'm not going to mention any names. It's only fair. I'm going to begin with the easy questions, then move on to some harder ones. What kind of pets do you have? I have a dog. She's a 5-month-old Catahoula who was born with a double Merle gene trait. Double Merle gene traits are what causes deafness mostly, and sometimes blindness, and a lot of times heart problems in dogs that are born with the condition. She cannot hear anything. She is completely deaf and partially blind. She's cute, and she's obnoxious, and she's very willful and hard to train because she figures that if she doesn't want to do something, all she has to do is look away from me. Her name is Sweet Pea. She's a great dog, but she lets off some of the most silent but deadly farts I've ever smelled in a dog. Holy cow. I'm going to put her name up there on the website as my co-producer, so you'll get to see pictures of Sweet Pea. And off and on, she might do a blog post or something, just to be silly. Where in the world do you live? Well, I currently reside in Albuquerque, New Mexico. But I'm planning to move to Kansas City in the very near future. I love barbecue, so even if I'll really miss New Mexican food, I will have fantastic barbecue. It's a good trade. The New Mexican question, red or green? This refers to chili, not salsa, for those of you who are not from New Mexico. I like both, so I usually order Christmas. Off and on I'll vary from that, but not often. How do you decide what stories to tell? In these episodes, there are several stories within the story, right? So I choose stories that make my point. The stories that I tell usually expand on the thing that I want you to take away. In the 100 Seconds to Midnight episodes, I go through recent events, or I look at scientific sites. I choose topics that concern the scientific community, and I also strive to find stories that are interesting and entertaining, right? I mean, I'm talking about things that could be really, really boring. So, you try and put something in there that's going to make people laugh or make people wonder or make people realize that this is how things get done. And you try and make it entertaining. How long does it take for you to do research on one episode? Oh boy. I usually spend several hours finding the information. Then I spend days reading white papers and tracking down the history, right? Episodes normally drop about every 2 weeks because it takes me about 2 weeks to do research and write the stories. What's your favorite pizza? Okay, I'm going to be honest. I'm not a huge fan of pizza. But my favorite is mushroom, sausage, olives, and ground beef. I love me some meat. I am a carnivore. What qualifies you to do this podcast? Well, I have 15 years of experience in research. I spent 12 years in drug and vaccine development and preclinical research. I worked for 6 years in tuberculosis research. And I worked on SARS, MERS, COVID, cancer, cystic fibrosis, and several other diseases. In the last 3 years, I've been doing administrative work in quality assurance and regulatory compliance. So what I do is I make scientists follow the rules. And that's not easy. Why do you do this podcast? Well, I'm curious. I want to learn things. I want to figure out how life works. I love learning new things and exploring the world around me. And I wanted to share that with as many people as I could. Scientists are like that. We always want to learn new things. We like to explore. So the podcast gives me an outlet for my curiosity. What gave you the idea to do this podcast? I used to take my friends through graveyards. We would go through the potter's fields. So a potter's field is where the poor were buried. And these graves only have a year and a number on them. So it would be like 1964 and 27 would be the 27th grave that was dug in 1964. So what I could do is I could count the graves and figure out what killed the majority of people during that year. Let's choose 1964. It was probably measles that killed however many people. Sometimes you would find hundreds of graves in a certain year, and you knew that there was some epidemic of something. So 1964 was just before the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine became mandatory. My friend Claire wanted me to actually do a YouTube channel where she would video our adventures and ask questions as we went through the graveyards. Well, shortly after the first couple of videos that I never got around to editing, Claire moved from Colorado to Georgia, and I moved from Colorado to New Mexico. So, Cause of Death ended up being a podcast instead. How do you choose the music for the episodes? Well, okay, so I'm lazy. I went to Epidemic Sound and typed in dubstep. Literally. I love dubstep, so I wanted that sound for my podcast. So the regular episodes have one song that I play called There Is No Sequel by Philip Ayres, and the 100 Seconds to Midnight episodes have a different one called Time Off by Dama Beats. And I do this so that you can tell the episodes apart. Today's music is called Fire Flinger by Mark Torch. I like changing music, so I may pick one more for the More Than You Ever Wanted to Know episode so that you can tell them apart from the other episodes. I usually play a pretty good chunk of the songs before the episode, and then at the end of the episode, I just play the whole thing. So, my good friend Claire asked that I share a personal story from my life. She said that these stories defined me more than my resume, and I agree with that. That's fair. She wanted me to tell you where I was and what I was doing on 9/11. I'm going to opt for something far more funny and sillier and tell you about the time that I stowed away on a cruise ship. My daughter loves this story. I was living in Miami Beach, Florida, with a bunch of other people who were really too young to be set loose in Miami Beach, especially in the 80s. The 80s were a rough time in Miami. And, well, we were all living in an apartment building, and we used to go to the beach almost every day. So one day, my friend Sally and I are laying out on the beach, and a guy comes by. And you know, every day you go to the beach, somebody would offer you something different, right? They would offer you mostly weed, but every day it was something else, right? So this day we were laying out on the beach, and the guy came by and he offered us boarding passes on a boat to the Bahamas. He worked for the cruise line. Now here's the deal. We got boarding passes, but we weren't technically supposed to be on that boat. We didn't have staterooms. We didn't have any kind of permission to be there. So we got on a boat and we left the country. But we had boarding passes. It was a 3-day trip. We mostly slept on lawn chairs by the pool, or we went to the gym. We gambled, we drank. We spent one night on the beach in the Bahamas. And we never told anyone that we had left the country. We could have been in a lot of trouble looking back on this today. But we had a great time. And on the way back, I remember that the waiters were coming around with these drinks called Bahama Mamas. And they were morning drinks, right? They were like Bloody Marys. You drink them in the morning. And by noon, I was watching the fishies jump out of the ocean. Leaning over the railing, watching the fishies jump. Now, I don't know if I actually saw fishies. I have no idea. Maybe there were dolphins following the ship. No earthly idea. But there I was, watching fishies jump. Now, remember also that this was the 80s, long before 9/11. So all you had to have was a driver's license and a birth certificate on you. You didn't have to have a passport. And usually, no one ever knew. They picked people at random to show their ID. So when we went on the boat, all we showed was our boarding pass. We got on the boat. When we got off the boat, all we showed was a boarding pass. And then we got off the boat. That was my I stowed away on a cruise ship when I was 19 story. It was fun. Someone asked about my hobbies. Well, I play guitar. I learned to fingerpick before I learned to strum, so now I fingerpick really well. but I'm only now learning to strum. About 3 years later. I'm terrible at it, but I'm learning to get along with it. I'm working on it. I love to go hiking, and I'm waiting for my dog to get a little older so that she can go on longer hikes with me. She may never be able to hike off leash because of her disabilities, but she'll be a good companion, right? I like to travel. I've visited all of the continental 48 states, Mexico, Canada, and of course, the Bahamas. And the places that I want to go next are Iceland, Estonia, New Zealand, Austria, Israel, and Norway. I really wouldn't scoff at going anywhere, really, though. I've taken up residence in 14 states in the U.S., and I'm also picked the next place that I want to go. I've chosen Kansas since I know quite a few people there, and one of them is my daughter. Which is the perfect segue into the next question. Yes, I have one child. She's 30 years old. She lives in the Kansas City area and just got married in May to a great guy, so I guess I've gained a son, too. If anyone out there knows of a job opportunity in the Kansas City area, I'll send you my resume. Someone asked where my listeners are from. Well, I have listeners from all over the world. The top countries right now are the U.S., of course, because I've begged all of my friends to listen, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. Yay, New Zealand! The top 4 states listening are California, Texas, New Mexico, and Colorado. New Mexico and Colorado, you're lagging behind. I've begged you. I've bribed you. Step up your game, huh? I keep track of my geolocation, so I do track listeners, right? I want to see who's listening and where they live, and I love to see new listeners from new countries. I really like it when those people share the podcast with their friends, and I see the numbers go up in different places. I want to thank you all for listening. I'm always amazed to see places like South Africa, Austria, Poland, and Sweden show up. It's always amazing to me to see other countries around the world just show up on my geolocation. To me, this is a bigger measure of success than numbers. Numbers matter, but seeing all the places just matters to me more. What I found through tracking my geolocation is that every state, every location, every country has a place called Other. I have more listeners from Other than any other place. So for all of my Other listeners, thank you. I'd love to know your locations, and maybe one day Spreaker will be able to tell me where you are. But for now, know that I'm still tracking my Others as much as I track any of those that I can see. I was asked about how I got started in microbiology. Well, this is an interesting story. Long before I went to college, I wanted to be a veterinarian. I never got to go to school for that when I was younger, so I was sort of a late bloomer. By 1995, I was a single parent and trying to figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up, and in April of that year, Timothy McVeigh committed one of the worst acts of terrorism on American soil, the Oklahoma City bombing. That event affected me like no other event before it. And I wouldn't be devastated again until September 11th of 2000. The Oklahoma City bombing made me think of ways that I could get involved, right? How I could help change things, how I could do something. I don't know, so I was a little old to go into the FBI, but bioterrorism was an idea that kept rolling around in the back of my head for a while. Because bioterrorism is a real threat, right? You wouldn't think that it would be, since disease is not something you can really control. The risk may not be worth the reward, but some people still try to use things like anthrax to kill people, right? So I could work in a lab, and that wouldn't be a problem. And that would put me in a situation where I could do some good against some terroristic threats. It would be another 10 years before I could go to school, And when I started my associate's degree, my focus was in medical laboratory technology. And I found that I didn't really like working with people, and I wanted to do research. So when I started my bachelor's degree, I looked at a straight biology degree. One of my professors at Texas A&M was a conservation biologist, and I loved listening to his lectures, and I looked forward to his class. He got me set up tracking map turtles for a summer, and that was amazing. So I really wanted to go into conservation biology after that. But he talked me out of it. He told me that conservation biology was a really hard field to get into and that I would never make any money at it. It was fun and it was interesting and I would get to observe wildlife from across the country, but I would probably be better off if I stuck with microbiology. So at the time, A&M didn't have a microbiology department, and I moved back to Colorado because Colorado State University did have a microbiology department. My main focus through my bachelor's degree was doing research on agents of bioterrorism. And I did get to do some of that, but not until much later in my career. So I've worked with things like sarin, chlorine, cyanide, mustard gas, and ricin. I've also worked with bacterial agents and viruses that could be used in terrorist attacks. Dangerous stuff, but really interesting. And the last question I got was that somebody asked me where I was from originally. Well, I grew up in Colorado. My childhood was spent in La Vida, a very small town in southern Colorado that lies about 100 miles north of Raton, New Mexico. I went to high school in Denver, and then I started moving around the country for a bit. Colorado will always sort of be my home base, but now that it's gotten so expensive to live there, I doubt that I'll ever be able to move back. Oh, no, there's one more. Why did you change the logo? Well, I changed the logo to reflect the 100 Seconds to Midnight episodes. I actually rebranded the whole podcast. I wanted the logo to tell my story, and I didn't feel that the old one was edgy or dangerous enough. It was pretty, but my show is not pretty. Okay, so that's the Getting to Know Me episode. I hope you enjoyed that. If you have any other questions, I feel free to ask. I'm kind of an open book. If you want to ask questions about me, if you want to ask questions about the podcast, mostly I get questions about disease, and that's fine too. I just kind of wanted everyone to know that I was a real person, so that way you maybe ask a few personal questions, or maybe someone out there actually wanted to know this stuff. I don't know. I thought it'd be fun. So here we are having fun. I didn't want to be serious all the time, is basically what it came down to. So that's it. That is the Q&A Meet Me episode. I want to thank you all for listening to Cause of Death, 100 Seconds to Midnight. And I'll see you next week when I talk about the global banking crisis. Have a great week.